This chapter is on tissues. And if y'all remember from the first few chapters, we said that we have levels of organization when it comes to the body, and that we have atoms that help to make up molecules, and molecules that help to make up macromolecules. Macromolecules make up organelles. Organelles are inside of cells, and cells help to make tissues. And so that's where we are before we get into specific systems, which now we have entered true human A&P, starting with this chapter. And tissues will help to make up those organs that we will get into as we get to every system. Okay? So, again, like I just said, tissues are going to be a group of cells, and those cells are going to work together with some similar function, may even have similar structure as well. And the four types of tissues, please make sure you know this. We have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Now, the one that you may be, or the ones that you may be most familiar with, may be muscle and nervous tissue. We know what muscle is, we know what nerve tissue is. Connective may not be as familiar, or it may be. And then epithelial tissue is more so our skin. And so this is the order in which we will talk about the tissues for this chapter. Before we get into the actual types of tissues, we're going to talk about what keeps those cells that help to make the tissues, what keeps them together. And so the connection between the two cells that help to make up tissues, we call that a junction. And we have a couple or three different types of junctions we'll discuss. The first is a tight junction, where the cells are extremely close together. And literally, for a tight junction, the cell membrane will somewhat fuse together. And this is going to be where we have to have very easy access from one cell to the next. For instance, the blood-brain barrier, where we want nutrients that are in the brain to get in, or in the blood to get into the brain, and things that may be in the brain to get out. So it needs to be very, very tight between those two. And even the digestive system, where we're having constant absorption of nutrients. And that's the example here. The top one is an example of a tight junction. And the second is desmosomes. Desmosomes are going to form what we call spot whales. And that's this structure right here. That's a spot whale. It's somewhat of a reinforcement, somewhat of a bridge between the two cells. They're still connected, but not where the membranes fuse together like tight junctions. And then we have gap junctions, kind of like when we're talking about gap channels between two or within the cell membrane. Here we have channels that are between two cells to help them communicate between each other. Okay, so again, tight junctions, cell membrane fuses for two cells. Desmosomes, you have spot whales, where it's somewhat of a structural reinforcement or bridge between the two. And then we have these gap junctions that have this channel here where they can exchange materials as necessary. So we're going to get into our very first tissue type, which is epithelial tissue. And this is going to be our skin. But when we say skin, we're not just talking about the skin that's on the outside of the body. We're talking about the skin that's all over, and inside and outside. When we say inside, that's those that kind of line our organs, the outside and inside of our organs. And also glands, which we don't sometimes consider to be part of epithelial tissue, but they are made up of epithelial tissue as well. And so whenever we see epithelial tissue, we're going to talk about this bullet here. We're going to have what we call a free surface, where we have the cells, and I'm going to attempt to draw some cells that are kind of together. So we have cells that are here, but then we're also going to have what we call a basement membrane on the inside, And so we'll have a basement membrane that's kind of connecting or attached to those cells. And so this will be what we call, this may have maybe some cilia on the outside. This is the free surface. And then this will be our basement membrane. Okay. And then we also have another characteristic that's kind of unique to our epithelial tissues, that is avascular. Now, avascular means that it has no blood supply. No blood supply. Definitely something that's important to know, especially when we get into talking about the integumentary system, knowing that epithelial tissue does not have a blood supply of their own, and they have to have nutrients that's going to come from other tissues. In this case, like it says, nutrients are going to diffuse from underlying connective tissue from the basement membrane. We'll talk more about that when we get into the integumentary system as well, but I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about in this unit as well. They can also heal very, very rapidly. You have witnessed this, I'm sure, before if you've ever had a scratch on your arm or leg or wherever, and within a week or so, those cells have completely healed and there are no issues. So, we have different ways that we can classify epithelial tissue. Before we get into the specific names, the very first way that we can classify epithelial tissue is by its shape. So we have three types or three shapes of epithelial tissue. We have squamous cells. Squamous cells are going to be very flat, kind of scale-like tissues. Cuboidal will be more cube shape. And then columnar will be more column shape, kind of like the ones that I drew on the last slide. And then we can also, in addition to classifying epithelial tissue based on shape, we can classify them based on layers. And so if we only have a single layer of epithelial tissue, that's going to be considered simple. And then if it's more than one layer, that's stratified. And then pseudo, the prefix pseudo means false or fake. And so it looks like it's layered or it looks stratified, but it's not. And so the example of a single layer cells will be kind of like this one, or even the one that I drew on the last slide. Stratified is if we had, let's say these were squamous cells, but we have multiple layers of squamous cells. And so this would be our stratified epithelial. And so when we name epithelial tissue, we don't just say this is squamous or this is stratified. We put these things together. So we can say simple squamous epithelial or stratified cuboidal epithelial. So we put the shape with the layer so that we can specifically identify the type of epithelial tissue we are talking about. And so the very first we're going to talk about is simple squamous epithelial. With simple squamous epithelial, that means that we have, hopefully you're thinking, what do you think it looks like? One layer of flat cells. And so one layer of flat cells, you can imagine, like this picture shows, is very, very thin. And so this top kind of yellowish layer, those are the cells. They're very, very thin. And so they're going to be in places where diffusion has to happen very rapidly or easily. For instance, where we have blood vessels where we need to allow blood to diffuse out of an area. Also, you'll find these in the alveoli, which are the air sacs that we have within the lungs. and that's so that oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse like it needs to in and out of the body. And so very, very thin area. But if you notice, like I said, every type of epithelial tissue will have this basement membrane. And this area is going to be where it gets its nutrients from, because remember, they are avascular cells. So it has to have this area that is connected to, kind of anchoring it down, and it also gives nutrients to those cells as well. Next, we have simple cuboidal. Again, kind of think about what that should look like. Since it's simple cuboidal, it should be one layer of cube-shaped cells. And so this is going to be also thin, but we find this in places like our glands. And it says free surface lines the lumen. That's this last bullet here. So we have our glands, ovaries, kidneys is where we'll find these. But free surface lines the lumen. Now we talked about what the free surface is. The free surface is this area right here. But when we say lumen, the lumen is this innermost portion right here. So this innermost portion would be the lumen. I'm not sure if you can really see that as I've written. But that means that this part here is the free surface, and on this other side is where you'll find the basement membrane. So if looking at this one, this will be our free surface, because this inside kind of opening is called the lumen. So the inside here, that will be the free surface of those cells. And then we go to the other side of those cells. That is where you will find the basement membrane. Also, make sure that you make note of where these tissue types are found. Simple squamous, alveoli, in our blood and lymphatic vessels, simple cuboidal, ovaries, kidneys, glands is where you will find these. Next, simple columnar. So this is kind of similar to the one that I attempted to draw a few slides ago. Simple columnar means that we have a single layer of column-shaped cells, and we're going to find this in a lot of places that are going to be responsible for absorption, like the uterus, also the stomach, intestines, and also not just absorption but secretion as well. An interesting, or I guess unique thing to the simple columnar is that they will sometimes have cilia. And cilia, if y'all remember, those hair-like projections that help with movement. So you'll find this at the free surface of those cells. They'll also have microvilli. Now, microvilli or villi will be something that we'll talk about, or you'll talk about whenever you get into the digestive system. They are responsible for increasing surface area so that things can absorb easily, because it's a lot more surface area when you have, microvilli kind of looks like cilia. It's just these projections that come from the cell, kind of like cilia here. But because we have all these projections, now things can be absorbed from all over these projections instead of having just a flat free surface. So it's a lot more area to absorb materials from if it's like this than say I'm just absorbing it from this flat surface. So that's why it's so important to have microvilli on these cell types, because they're found in places like the stomach and the intestines. In addition, they will sometimes have goblet cells. Goblet cells will also be something we'll talk a lot more about, but these are going to be responsible for secreting mucus. And you'll see goblet cells a lot in the next type of epithelial tissue type, which is pseudostratified columnar. With pseudostratified columnar, the reason why it's pseudostratified is because it looks like it's layered, but it's not. The reason why it looks like it's layered is because we have nuclei on all different levels. But if you were to look at each individual cell, you would notice that the cell itself actually terminates, all of the cells terminate at the basement membrane. Okay, and so because they all terminate the basement membrane, we know that it's only one layer. It just looks like it's multiple layers because we have nuclei at different levels. This type of cell most often will have cilia. They will not have microvilli, but they're also going to have goblet cells. This will be found definitely in the respiratory passages, so that whenever we inhale some type of dirty debris or some type of pathogen gets in the way, those goblet cells will then release mucus so that it can trap the dirt or debris, and the cilia can then brush the mucus either towards the mouth or towards the stomach so that it can get it out of the respiratory passageway. The next type of epithelial tissue we have is stratified squamous epithelial. We'll talk a lot more about this one when we get into the next section about the integumentary system. Stratified squamous tells you that it has multiple layers of flat cells. So there are a lot of cells that are stacked on each other, but they're flat. Now, it does look, if you kind of look at it a little closer, those deeper cells are actually cube-shaped. But what happens in this tissue type is that as these cells are produced at this very bottom layer, and this is something we'll talk about more in the next section, but as they're pushed upward, what happens is that they will flatten, they're pushed upward, and they die. And so this area is where you will find those flat cells. Okay, you'll see a picture very similar to this one as well. But this outer layer is going to be those dead cells. They're also going to be a lot tougher, keratinized, which means it has that protein keratin in it to make it waterproof, and a bit stronger as well. And we'll find these not only in the places that are listed here, but even just on the surface of the body. We have it within our mouth, the vagina, and anal canal as well. And the next is stratified cuboidal, which means we have multiple layers of cube-shaped cells. Also found in some of our glands. And so if y'all remember, one way to kind of remember this, if you remember our simple cuboidal also are found in glands. Stratified cuboidal are found in glands. Now, two different types of glands, but they're still found in glands. So that may be one way to kind of help you remember that cuboidal cells, going back to this one, lines some of our glands. Also, of course, our ovaries and things like that, but some glands have simple cuboidal. Whereas with stratified cuboidal, several glands, mammary, sweat, salivary, and pancreas will all be types of glands that have some stratified cuboidal cells or tissue in it. The next, stratified columnar. Again, stratified means that we have multiple layers, column-shaped cells, but this is very similar to stratified squamous, whereas those deeper cells are actually more cube-shaped. But as they are going upward, they do take this column or columnar shape to them, so they're named for the shape that's on the outside or towards the free surface. And you'll find these also in places like some glands, exocrine glands specifically, and the male urethra, which is the tube through which urine and semen will pass. And then we have transitional epithelial. Transition, if you just think about the word transition, means to change. Just like when we were talking about transcytosis, means to go from one thing to the next. Transitional means that we're changing as well. And so with transitional epithelial, it changes shape. It can go from being cube shaped to elongated shapes. And so it just depends on the structure that it's within. If it's stretched, then it could have one shape, but if it's not stretched, it could have another shape. Okay, and you'll find this in places like the bladder. So, the bladder is going to be full at times, and then it's not going to be full in times. And so when it changes shape with increased tension, which means it may be full, it's going to stretch a little bit more when it's not. And this last little part about epithelial cells will be our glandular epithelial, where we'll have our glands. Okay, so types of epithelium found in our glands. And if you remember, or if you think about types of glands, we have two different types: endocrine, exocrine. Endocrine, the prefix endo means inside, and so endocrine glands are secreting fluids into the blood or into the body. Exocrine, exo means outside, and so it is secreting it to the outside of the body. Okay, so anything that's being secreted to the outside of the body, we'll consider an exocrine gland. And we also have two structural types of exocrine. That's unicellular and multicellular. It is what it sounds like. One cell, like the goblet cell, that has the mucus that's found within our pseudostratified columnar cells and simple columnar cells. We also have multicellular. It is what it sounds like, many cells. Also, again, these are the ones that are secreted, because it's exocrine, secreted outside the cell. We have our sweat glands, salivary glands. And so we're going to go in a little bit more detail about these multicellular glandular epithelial because they can be classified as either simple or compound depending on their structure. So, a simple gland or a simple glandular epithelial cell or not cell gland, is going to have branches or a duct that does not branch. So this part here is the actual duct, this top portion, and there's no branching from it. It's simple. So you should be able to just kind of recognize it just from the pictures. But simple, again, does not branch at the duct. But if you look at these two, the ducts are here and they're actually branched. And so that's how we know these are compound, because they're branching before it reaches that secretory portion. And then we have tubular and alveolar, which are pretty straightforward as far as being able to identify them. The ends of the secretory portion is tube-like for tubular, like this one, and this one. But with alveolar, they're more sac-like or rounded. And so this will be alveolar, this will be alveolar. Okay, so again, simple, the duct area does not branch, compound it does. Tubular is more of a tube-like into the secretory portion, and then with alveolar, it's more of a bulb or circular end to it. And then we can also classify them based on the amount of the secretion, or what allows them to secrete, or what comes out as things are being secreted. And so we have three different types: merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. Merocrine glands are going to be where the fluid products very small, but it's going to just be by exocytosis. And if y'all remember, we have vesicles that are being pushed towards the cell membrane, and those particles are pushed out. very small particles, right? But then we have apocrine glands where a little bit of the cell is actually going to be released. So if you notice here, we have actually part of the cell that's kind of being pinched off, and it's coming out of that gland. So this is like mammary or Serotinous glands, which are earwax glands, which are those modified sweat glands that we'll talk more about in the integumentary system. And then we have holocrine. I kind of think holocrine whole. And so the entire cell comes out for this one. And so this is going to be sebaceous glands. You may not know what sebaceous glands are at this point, but sebaceous glands are our oil glands, and they secrete sebum or oil from the glands that are within the skin. So these are just types of secretions based on what is actually secreted out, whether it's just small fluid particles or part of the cell or the entire cell. And you notice when the cell is released for this one, you have more of the cell that's being formed via mitosis. Now, we're going to get into connective tissue. Now, connective tissue is the one that you may not be as familiar with as the others, but we have connective tissue everywhere. It is the most abundant type of tissue that we have within the body, and it does a lot. A lot of those, I kind of think of this connective tissue as being this catch-all group because it does everything. It ranges from blood to bone to cartilage. It's a ton of things that consist of or is characterized and categorized as connective tissue. There are tons of functions, and we'll get to each of these as we go through the types of connective tissue. Now, if you remember, we said that epithelial tissue is avascular, all epithelial tissue. But with connective tissue, the vascularity is going to vary. So it's not going to be the same from one tissue type to the next. Okay? So they'll have nutrients, but the vascularity is going to vary from one to the next. And we'll kind of talk about that as we go through. So if you all remember, we said that cells help to make up tissues. And so these are the major cell types that help to make up the tissues that we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So the very first tissue type, or the very first cell type of connective tissue is the fibroblast. And fibroblasts are going to be cells that help to produce fibers, and they're going to help kind of form this extracellular matrix to kind of piece things together, and we'll talk more about that as well later. Macrophages. Macrophages are going to be responsible for phagocytosis. Now, hopefully we remember phagocytosis is a type of transport where it is engulfing a solid particle. And so these phagocytes are going to be responsible for engulfing those things that should not be there. So those things that are foreign so that it can defend against infection. And the other type of connective tissue cell is a mast cell. Mast cells are going to be responsible for secreting or releasing heparin. And heparin is what is there within the body to help with blood clotting. Helps to stimulate the blood clotting process. Okay. Also, histamine. If you remember, if you've ever taken medication that has antihistamine, it's because we are feeling the inflammatory response. We feel swelling. We have a little bit redness. We just aren't feeling well. That's because histamine has been released. And so because we are uncomfortable, we may take an antihistamine to kind of reduce the effects of the histamine that's released from our mast cells. All right, so we're going to go into the fibers that fibroblasts produce. Remember, we have fibroblasts, macrophages, and mast cells. Those are the three types of cells that help to make up connective tissue. Now, as far as fibroblasts, which is that first type of cell, remember they secrete fibers. So this is a list of the fibers that we're going to talk a lot about as we go through the types of connective tissue that come from fibroblasts. So the very first one are collagen fibers. You all may have heard of collagen before. Sometimes people may get collagen injections within their face or somewhere else, but it helps with strengthening, it helps with tightening. It is that structural protein, and because it is so strong, but it's also a bit flexible. Because of that, it is great in places like the tendons and the ligaments because it's so strong. But it does have a little bit of elasticity and flexibility. Now, our elastic fibers, because of the name, it tells you that they are very elastic. Okay, they are very stretchy, right? They can stretch and then bounce back to where they are. But they're not as strong as collagen. So the strongest, not as strong. These have a bit of flexibility. These have a lot of stretch, a lot of flexibility. And then we have our reticular fibers. It's the last type of fiber that's secreted by our fibroblasts. Very thin, very delicate. We're going to find these in some of our delicate organs. And if you've ever dissected an organism like a cat or a pig, you may notice that the spleen, the liver are very delicate, kind of thin-ish organs. They're not as tough as some of the other ones that we kind of think about. So, we have this list tells us the types of connective tissue that we're going to go over the next few slides. So, when we say just regular connective tissue, they can be categorized as either loose or dense. Now, the word dense may mean something to you because that means that things are tightly packed together. I kind of remember that when we get into dense connective tissue. They're tightly packed together. And then we have our loose connective tissue where they're not as tightly packed together. But it does have some of those fibers that we just mentioned on the last slide. And then we have some specialized connective tissues. These are the ones that people may not even realize are considered tissues, like blood. No one will really kind of think of blood as being a tissue, but remember what a tissue is. It is a group of cells. And so blood has tons of cells that help to make it up. So that is why blood is considered to be a tissue. So the very first type of connective tissue is areolar connective tissue. And we're going to find this in places like the underside or the basement membrane of the skin. So if you remember, I talked about how we have this multiple layers of cells for the skin, stratified, squamous, epithelial. But on the underside of that, we have this basement membrane for the skin. And when I say skin, at this point, I'm talking about the skin on the surface of the body. This is where we find our subcutaneous layer. Sub means below, cutaneous means skin. So below the skin is where we'll find areolar tissue. If you notice, there are lots of fibroblasts that are here, specifically collagen and elastic or elastin fibers. So we have those very strong fibers and we have those very flexible fibers that are found in this type of connective tissue. Then we have adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is going to be our fats or adipocytes. Those are just fat cells. So adipose is our fats. And this is also found in the subcutaneous layer, which is below the skin. So underneath our skin that we know, we have fat. We also have behind the eyeballs, we have it around muscles. If you were to dissect a heart, which you may do later in the A&P, around the heart we have fat. We don't want a lot, of course, but there is fat that's there. And fat cells are there for cushion, is there for insulation to keep us warm. So, sometimes fat does get a bad reputation, but it's there for a good reason. And then we have reticular connective tissue. With reticular connective tissue, we have our reticular fibers. And if you remember, this is going to be the one that are very thin, very delicate. That was the very last, going back to this slide, the very last type of fiber that we have. But it's going to be made up of reticular connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue is made up of those reticular fibers. And that's going to be places like the liver and the spleen, as we discussed before. Now on to our dense connective tissue. Again, dense just means that these fibers are going to be closely packed together. If you kind of look at the picture of all of the loose connective tissue, like this one, and this one, and this one, they're not as closely packed as this one. And so these are all going to be dense connective tissue. The first one is dense regular because it's more of a homogeneous type of a look. If you were to look at the fibers comparing to one of the ones we're going to look at next. But it has a lot of collagenous fibers, or that collagen, and also a little small network of those elastic fibers as well. Very, very strong because it has so much collagen and is that dense connective tissue. Remember, we said that these collagen fibers are going to be found in places that are very, very strong, or need to be very, very strong, like the tendons and ligaments. We also find this in the dermis. And the dermis is the second layer of skin. Now, what's so interesting about this, though, is that it has a poor blood supply. Remember, we said that the vascularity of connective tissue varies. This one's going to have a poor blood supply, and that's why if a person has like an ACL tear, which is a cruciate ligament within the knee, they're usually out for a long time, getting it, hoping it can heal as quickly as it can, but it's not going to heal as quick as some other things would heal or can heal. It's definitely not going to heal as fast as epithelial tissue. Now we have dense irregular. So if you notice, comparing this picture to the last, this one is not as homogeneous all the way through, but those fibers are tightly packed. And it's a lot of collagen fibers that are there as well. And this is also going to be found within the dermis of the skin. So within the dermis, we have our dense irregular. We also have some dense regular tissue. And the dermis of the skin is the part that's right underneath our epithelial tissue at the top, that stratified squamous epithelial that is easily regenerated. Okay. And then we have our elastic connective tissue. Because it's still within this dense, it is going to be closely packed together, but it's made up of, as you can probably guess, elastic fibers. We do have a bit of collagen fibers there as well, but mostly our elastic fibers. So that means it can bend a little bit. We have a little bit of give. And so we're going to find this in not those super stiff places, but it is going to have a bit of structure because of those collagen fibers that are there as well. So parts of the heart, this picture is showing the aorta, which is that main artery that leads from the heart. Also our airways, so it has this good stretch to it, but also is slightly strong as well. And so the next few will be our specialized connective tissue types like cartilage. And, if I had to ask you, where do you find cartilage? You may say your ear, your nose. Some may even remember that we have cartilage in our joints between two bones. And so it's there as this support, this protection, to help connect things. And so some other terms that you need to know: chondrocytes. Now, I've mentioned before, anytime you see CYTES, that's in reference to cell. A chondrocyte is a cartilage cell. And these chondrocytes, when we're looking at cartilage, are going to be found in chambers or in holes or in chambers. Is probably the best word. And those chambers are called lacunae. Now, I'm just kind of introducing this now, but the term lacunae will come up later in Human A&P. So those chambers, again, are filled with the cartilage cells, and we call those chondrocytes. And this one, remember we said that connective tissue vascularity is going to vary. It is avascular. Because it's avascular, it heals very, very, very slowly. It doesn't have a good nutrient supply like epithelial cells, even though epithelial cells are avascular as well. We also have three types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. The first one, hyaline cartilage, still these are going to be made up of those fibers that we were just referring to, collagen fibers. If you remember, those are the ones that are very tough. They have a bit of flexibility, but very, very tough. So we're going to find these in places like the ends of our long bones, where we make our joints. Also, the nose, respiratory passages. It says the embryonic skeleton. The skeleton, as we are an embryo, is not ossified because it starts off as a hyaline cartilage model. We also find them between our ribs and our sternum. We also find hyaline cartilage there. And then we have elastic cartilage. Elastic probably tells you that we have a little bit of elastic fibers. Because it's that elastic fibers and not the collagen fibers, it has a little bit of flexibility. And so this is the type of cartilage that we find in our ears and also in our larynx, which is where we find our voice box and our Adam's apple, informally called Adam's apple. And then the last type is our fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage, many collagen fibers, which means very, 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 very tough. And so we also have cartilage, again, between bones, but specifically in this one, between the vertebrae. So between each vertebrae, this kind of red-orange section, that's cartilage that's there. It's there to kind of absorb the shock, to make it easier when we move around. We don't want to disturb the spine that's there. Also, we have it in parts of the pelvic girdle and knee as well. Another specialized connective tissue type is bone. Now, the bone we know is extremely rigid because of the collagen that's there, but it also has salts, mineral salts that's primarily made up of calcium. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we know that the bone is just there to help protect, support, also so that muscles can have a place to attach to. And the cells that help to make up bone, like chondrocytes are the cells that make up cartilage. Osteocytes, remember site means cell. Osteo is in reference to bone. Osteocytes are our bone cells, and it's also inside of lacunae. Lacunae, remember, are those chambers that hold the cells. cells of chondrocytes and cartilage, and the osteocytes for bone. We have two different types that we can talk about later. And those two are compact bone and spongy bone. You find those in different parts of the body or of the bone as well. So compact bone, compact because it's tightly packed together. We'll find this in places like the middle part of our long bones, and I'll be able to show that to you later. And we also have these osteoblasts, which are the cells. Remember, I found in lacunae. So these spaces and these X's that I'm drawing, those are the osteocytes, and the circles that I'm drawing are the lacunae. And so they are arranged in very specialized, very particular rings. And these rings, this ring that I formed here, that's called a lamellae. And I said ring, but you can also use the word layer, because we have many layers of osteocytes inside lacunae. It keeps layering around and layering around. Okay? And so as we have several layers of lamellae, which are these layers or these rings of the osteocytes inside of lacunae. So again, the lacunae were the circles that I'm drawing, or these spaces. The osteocyte is inside. And then we have lamellae, which are these rings that have formed. The center part, we have nothing here. That's going to be called the central canal. And within the central canal is where we have blood vessels, we have nerves, because of course bone is an organ. And so this entire unit, lamellae around the central canal, that is called an osteon. And so if you look at one of these pictures, so for instance, this will be one osteon, and this is the central canal. This is another osteon. That's the central canal. And so compact bone has several osteons that form or are compacted together to create compact bone. And then our other connective tissue type is blood. And blood, of course, is made up of many cells. That's why it gets its name as being a tissue. We have red blood cells, we have white blood cells, we have platelets, and they all help to do different things. Our red blood cells are going to help to transport carbon dioxide and oxygen, and our white blood cells are going to help to defend against foreign pathogens. Platelets help with blood clotting. This is something you'll get in a lot more detail when we talk about blood within the cardiovascular system. Our next tissue type is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is found many places throughout the body. We have three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle, please make sure that you know specific, unique characteristics about each one. Skeletal muscle is going to be the only one of the three that's voluntary. The only one that's voluntary. It's also striated. It's one other that's going to be striated, and I'll tell you more about what that means. It just means that they have these stripes and bands because the fibers that help, or the proteins that make it up, are arranged in such a way that causes these stripes or striations and bands. It's also multinucleated, which means that it has multiple nuclei. They're not branches, literally just these rod-shaped cells, and those cells are going to have multiple nuclei within them. In addition, we have our smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is called smooth because it does not have those stripes and bands. It is non-striated. That's why it's smooth. This one is going to be involuntary. That means we cannot control this one. We can't control our blood vessels. We cannot control our bladder. We cannot control our uterus. And those are the places that we find smooth muscle. We can't control the stomach or the intestines. And the last type of muscle tissue is another one that's involuntary, which means we cannot control it, of course, is cardiac muscle, found in the heart. Now, a lot different from the other two is that they're branching cells, which means if you look at this one, it kind of branches down to this one. This cell branches off to this one. This cell branches off to this one. And so in between each also, we have what we call intercalated disc. This is one that's going to be a characteristic that is unique to this tissue type, which is just that portion that kind of connects one cell to the next. That's an intercalated disc. That's intercalated disc. That's another thing. So this is one thing that is unique to cardiac muscle. As far as smooth muscle, it's the only one that's non-striated. And as far as skeletal muscle, it's the only one that is voluntary. And the last tissue type is nervous tissue or nerve tissue. Nerve tissue is going to be found in the brain, spinal cord, and all of those nerves that branch off from it. And so we have two types of cells that help to make up nerve tissue. We have our neurons and our neuroglia. Our neurons are going to be the ones that are going to be the main player that's responsible for sending and receiving signals. Whereas neuroglia is that support system. It helps to make sure that it gets its nutrients. It helps to make sure that the signals are being sent as fast as they need to be. The analogy that I like to use for neurons and neuroglia, neurons, that's Beyonce. It's going to be doing the work. It's going to be making sure that the job gets done. But neuroglia is the entourage. So it's a support system, making sure that Beyonce gets fed, make sure that she gets where she needs to go to as fast as she needs to get there. So it's the support system for that main player of this type of tissue. And that is the end of this unit. If you have questions, again, please leave them in the comment section or be prepared to share them in class.